This is the moment loyalty stopped being a shield and became a weapon pointed in the wrong direction. Picture the scene. Wednesday morning, April 2nd, 2026. A black government SUV rolling from the White House toward the Supreme Court. Two people inside. The President of the United States and his Attorney General. Somewhere on that short drive, Donald Trump leaned over and told Pam Bondi she was fired. And then something extraordinary happened. She smiled. She walked into the Supreme Court. She sat next to him. She watched the oral arguments on birthright citizenship. She shook hands. She laughed at the right moments. She performed for cameras for an entire additional day, knowing she had already been removed from the second most powerful law enforcement position in the United States. As of 8:14 a.m. Eastern Time, Friday, April 24, 2026, the woman who spent 14 months bending the Department of Justice further in Donald Trump's direction than any attorney general in modern history, who pledged there would never be an enemies list at the DOJ and then helped build one, who told the world an Epstein client list was sitting on her desk and then had her own department say the list did not exist, that woman is now sitting outside the administration. No job lined up. A congressional subpoena still carrying her name, and a silence that Washington is watching very carefully, because when someone that close to that many secrets stops being protected by the office they held, silence becomes the most expensive currency in the room. In this breakdown, we are going to trace every step of how Pam Bondi went from Trump's most loyal cabinet defender to the most dangerous ex-official in Washington. How a woman who survived Trump's first term defended him through 2 impeachments and gave up a federal judge appointment to run his Justice Department ended up fired on a car ride with no severance, no next job, and a House subpoena that her own allies refused to kill after she left the building. How the Epstein files, a promise that electrified the MAGA base and should have been a moment of triumph, became the slow-burning fuse that blew the entire arrangement apart. And what Bondi does next, because what she does next has the potential to reshape the second term in ways that no foreign policy crisis, no trade war, and no congressional vote has come close to touching. Trump did not just fire his attorney general. He lit a match and handed it to someone who knows exactly where the kindling is buried. 14 months ago, Pam Bondi walked into her Senate confirmation hearing and made a promise that her entire tenure would eventually make a mockery of. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Bondi would take the Department of Justice and reshape it from the inside. She would dismantle what the Trump team called the weaponized apparatus of the Biden years. She would pursue the president's political opponents with the full institutional weight of the federal government behind her. She would deliver the kind of aggressive, loyal, visibly committed performance that Jeff Sessions had refused to give and that Bill Barr had only partially provided. She would be the attorney general Trump had always wanted, the one who understood that loyalty was not just a virtue inside this White House. It was the only currency that mattered. It was supposed to deliver historic results. Trump's opponents indicted. The Epstein files finally cracked open after years of public hunger. The deep state dismantled. The DOJ reclaimed for the people in Trump's framing, not for the bureaucrats who had spent decades building it into a fortress his movement could not touch. But the hidden cost of the plan was never fully calculated at the start. Bondi was promising things that the actual machinery of the Justice Department, the career prosecutors, the federal judges, the evidentiary rules that govern what you can bring to a grand jury, could not deliver on her timeline or on her president's terms. Every political enemy Trump named, Brennan, Comey, James, had lawyers and paper trails and rights that the courts refused to simply set aside because a president wanted results. The cases were thin. The courts kept saying so. And every time a prosecution went sideways, it did not just fail quietly. It failed publicly, in a way that made the entire operation look like what the opposition had always said it was, performance rather than prosecution. Then came the Epstein files. And everything that could go wrong did. Bondi told Fox News in a live interview that an Epstein client list was sitting on her desk right now. The words went everywhere within minutes. The MAGA base erupted. Conservative influencers began counting down the hours to the revelation that would name names and change everything. And then Bondi's own department walked it back. There was no client list. There had never been a client list on her desk. What there was a primetime statement that had electrified an audience, raised expectations to an impossible height, and handed every opponent of the administration a moment they would replay for months. She assumed Trump's loyalty ran as deep as hers. She assumed wrong. At 10:23 a.m. on Wednesday, April 2nd, 2026, a post appeared on Truth Social that contained exactly 147 words and ended Pam Bondi's career in federal government. There was no phone call to warn allies. No preparation for the press team. No choreographed announcement with a replacement ready to step in front of cameras and project continuity. Just a Truth Social post, a brief paragraph calling Bondi a great American patriot and a loyal friend, and a single line saying she would be transitioning to a much-needed and important new job in the private sector. No specifics. No job named. Because there was no job. 3 sources confirmed to CNN within the hour that Bondi had nothing lined up. The private sector role was a placeholder phrase, not a plan. For 24 hours before that post, Bondi had known she was finished. She sat next to the president at the Supreme Court. She attended his address to the nation that evening. She smiled through every camera. And at the same time, in what people close to the situation described as a last-ditch effort to prove her value before the announcement landed, she had summoned the Miami U.S. attorney and other officials to a meeting to push for movement on a prosecution Trump had been demanding. She was trying to deliver results on the same day she had already been told she would not be there to see them. Pause. The woman who had been told she was fired was still trying to save her job by doing the things she had been fired for not doing fast enough. While Bondi was in that meeting, something else was also happening. Inside the West Wing, the question of what to do with the House oversight subpoena that had been issued in her name was being actively discussed. The subpoena required her to appear before the committee on April 14th. It had been issued by name, not by title. That meant her removal from the Attorney General's office did not automatically cancel it. Republican Rep. Nancy Mace, who had led the subpoena effort, made that clear within hours of the firing announcement. The subpoena still stands, she posted. Release the Epstein files. While Republican members of the House were refusing to let Bondi walk away from her congressional obligations, something else was also happening in Washington's legal and political circles. The calculation being made by every operative, every journalist, and every lawyer who understood what Bondi knew was arriving at the same conclusion at the same time. A fired attorney general with no next job, no promised judgeship, a live congressional subpoena, and 14 months of front-row access to the most sensitive legal and political decision-making in the federal government is not a problem that disappears when you post 147 words on Truth Social. She is a problem that has just been handed a set of circumstances that changes every calculation about what she will say and to whom she will say it. The bond markets did not move, but Washington's internal market, the one that prices information, access, and risk, moved significantly. According to 8 sources who spoke to NBC News in the hours before the firing was announced, Trump had been privately trashing Bondi's performance for weeks, if not months. The complaints were not new and they were not quiet. They had been circulating inside the West Wing long enough that multiple senior staff members were aware the relationship was deteriorating, even as Bondi was still appearing at press conferences and roundtables presenting a unified front. The specific grievances, as described by people with direct knowledge of conversations Trump was having, fell into 2 categories. The first was the Epstein disaster. Not simply the client list blunder, but the entire arc of the release, the near-empty binders distributed to conservative influencers at the White House in February, the Democrats walking out of the closed-door briefing and calling it a fake hearing, the House oversight subpoena issued with bipartisan support, and the fact that the base that had been promised a revelation was left with millions of pages of documents that answered none of the questions they had been told would finally be resolved. Trump, according to one person who speaks with him regularly, saw the Epstein files as a gift that Bondi had somehow managed to turn into a liability. The second grievance was the prosecutions. Trump had names. He wanted indictments. Brennan, Comey, Letitia James. The cases had been in various stages of development for over a year. None of them had produced charges. Career prosecutors inside the DOJ were signaling, according to a source briefed on internal communications, that the cases were not strong and that pursuing them in Washington, D.C., where grand juries had repeatedly pushed back on politically driven prosecutions, carried real institutional risk. That assessment was not what Trump wanted to hear. That assessment, in the way this White House operates, became Bondi's problem. A senior advisor to Trump, speaking under strict anonymity to a political publication, described the final weeks of Bondi's tenure with a phrase that captured everything. She couldn't bring him the bleeding heads of his enemies on a platter like he wanted. That phrase, attributed publicly to Ty Cobb, a former Trump White House lawyer, is not a metaphor. It is a precise description of the expectation that Bondi was hired to meet, and that the Department of Justice's own institutional mechanics would not allow her to meet on the timetable or terms that her principal demanded. The cruelest part of the exit was the promise that never materialized. Sources told CNN that Trump had floated the possibility of a judicial appointment for Bondi after her departure. She had been led to believe there was an off-ramp that preserved her standing and offered a path to a powerful role. That possibility, according to the same sources, was gone before the Truth Social post was even published. She left with a thank you note and a subpoena. And a silence that is not going to hold. Why does any of this matter beyond the drama of one cabinet departure in an administration that has already gone through extraordinary turnover? Follow the exposure, because what Bondi knows is not a minor footnote in the political story of the second Trump term. It is the chapter that has the most unresolved questions attached to it. Bondi served as Attorney General for 14 months at the center of the most politically sensitive legal operation the Department of Justice has ever been asked to run. She was in the room, or in proximity to the room, for every major decision about what the DOJ pursued, what it declined to pursue, and how it managed the most explosive piece of pending public business in the department's current portfolio, which is the Epstein material and whatever it does or does not contain about powerful people in powerful places. The power shift created by her departure is not subtle. The moment she became a private citizen with a congressional subpoena, her incentives changed completely. As Attorney General, her obligation was to the department and, in practice, to the president's agenda. As a private citizen under subpoena from a bipartisan congressional committee, her obligation is to tell the truth under oath or face consequences that her former boss cannot shield her from. The DOJ's institutional protection does not follow her out the door. What Bondi chooses to do with that subpoena will define the next phase of this story. She can refuse and dare the committee to enforce it, which carries its own legal exposure now that she has no department behind her. She can appear and give answers that are carefully constrained and add nothing new. Or she can appear and answer honestly what she was asked to do, what she declined to do, and what she saw in the 14 months she ran the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country. The legal stakes are serious and genuinely unprecedented for this administration. A congressional subpoena of a former sitting attorney general, issued by name rather than by office, is not a routine oversight request. It is an instrument that, if fully enforced, would put someone with Bondi's specific knowledge under oath in front of a committee with the authority to refer criminal charges for contempt if she fails to comply. That is a legal exposure the White House cannot manage from the outside once she is no longer inside the building. You cannot fire your way out of a subpoena. And you cannot take back 14 months of access to information with a 147-word Truth Social post. Here is the domino effect that is now unfolding in real time, and each piece of it lands somewhere the White House did not want it to land. If Bondi honors the congressional subpoena, she testifies under oath about the Epstein files, about which prosecutions she was pressured to pursue, about conversations inside the DOJ concerning cases that are still open, and defendants who are still waiting to learn their fates. If that testimony is honest, it draws a direct line between the president's personal demands and the department's operational decisions in a way that every pending case involving a Trump political opponent becomes significantly more legally complicated. If those cases become legally complicated, the entire prosecution agenda that Todd Blanche is now supposed to deliver gets harder to execute, not easier. Beijing is not watching this story. But every Republican senator facing a 2026 midterm in a competitive district is watching it very closely. The Epstein files were supposed to be a populist home run, a transparency moment that unified the base and gave the administration a clean win on an issue that crossed partisan lines. Instead, they have produced a bipartisan House subpoena, a fired attorney general, a MAGA base that feels deceived, and a replacement AG whose first public statement about Epstein was that it should not be a part of anything going forward. That statement, delivered by Blanche on Fox News to a host who laughed in his face, is the clearest indication yet that the administration has no plan for what comes next on the file that most directly threatens to define Trump's second term in ways his base did not vote for. And where is Bondi in all of this? Where is the woman who 22 days after her firing has not given a single substantive interview, has not posted anything beyond a single loyalty statement on the day she left, and has not made any public indication of whether she intends to honor the subpoena or fight it? Silence. Deliberate, strategic, expensive silence. From someone who understands better than almost anyone inside this story exactly how much her words are currently worth and exactly how many people are waiting to hear them. This creates a fracture inside the Republican coalition that runs directly along the Epstein fault line. On one side, the MAGA loyalists who believe the files contain genuine revelations and that Bondi's failure to deliver them was a betrayal of everything the movement was promised. On the other side, the Republican institutionalists who understand that the files, honestly handled, reveal truths that are uncomfortable for powerful people across the political spectrum, and that opening that box fully has consequences that do not stop at party affiliation. A coalition divided between what it was promised and what the truth actually contains cannot hold that tension indefinitely. Reports from people close to Bondi describe a woman who is, for the first time in her relationship with Donald Trump, genuinely free of the obligation to protect him above everything else. She has no office to lose. She has no appointment to protect. She has no more loyalty tests to pass for an employer who fired her on a car ride after asking her to perform loyalty until the announcement was ready. She is, according to one person who has spoken to her since the firing, neither angry nor defeated. She is, in their word, calculating. They are the physical representation of a promise that the Trump movement made to its own base. That when the right people were finally in power, the truth about the most powerful and the most protected would no longer be buried. That promise drew millions of voters who believed that the system protected the wrong people and that this time, finally, it would be different. Pam Bondi was handed that promise and the institutional machinery to fulfill it, and what she produced was a set of binders that conservative influencers flipped through in real time and found almost empty. The promise and the delivery were so far apart that even the people most invested in believing had to admit the gap out loud. You can fire an attorney general. You cannot unpromise the truth to the people who voted because of it. You can replace the person holding the files. You cannot replace what the files do or do not contain, and you cannot replace the institutional memory of the person who spent 14 months deciding what got released and what did not. Trump wanted a loyal warrior who would deliver his enemies on a timeline his base would find satisfying. What he has instead is a former attorney general with no job, a live congressional subpoena, firsthand knowledge of 14 months of the most sensitive federal legal decision-making in a generation, and every reason in the world to tell her story on her own terms before someone else tells it for her. So where are we right now today? Bondi is outside the building. Todd Blanche is inside it, and his first public signal was that Epstein is over, which is not a message the base or the House Oversight Committee received quietly. The subpoena still carries her name. April 14th came and went without her testimony, but the committee's authority to compel it did not expire with the date. Trump is watching, which means Trump is calculating, which means the question of whether Bondi remains silent or begins to speak is being processed inside the same White House that fired her on a car ride and offered a judgeship it never delivered. Expect the White House to attempt to manage this with surrogates. Friendly media will begin framing any future Bondi testimony as disloyalty, as score settling, as the act of someone who failed at her job and is trying to deflect blame. The machinery of narrative control that this White House operates with considerable skill will be aimed at reducing Bondi's credibility before she has a chance to use it. That is the playbook, and it will be deployed with full force. He might offer her something, a quiet arrangement, a restored path to the judgeship, a signal that there is still a future for her inside this movement if she chooses the door that stays closed. He could attempt to have allies on the House Oversight Committee quietly bury the subpoena before it becomes an enforcement question. But what cannot be undone is that Pam Bondi now exists outside the protection of the office that kept her silent, with information that the most powerful figures in the country have reasons to want contained, and with a subpoena that gives her both the obligation and the platform to say what she knows in a setting where lying carries criminal consequences. Subscribe and stay close. The April 14th deadline passed. The subpoena did not. If Bondi makes any move toward testimony, voluntary or compelled, we will cover every word the moment it happens. If the House Oversight Committee escalates enforcement, that is a story that changes the trajectory of this entire second term. This is the inside story of a loyalty that was used up, handed back empty, and is now in the possession of someone who has every reason to decide that her truth is worth more than her silence. Watch closely. And watch what Pam Bondi does next.